Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ Graduate Level Certificate Program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, gives professionals the opportunity to bring in valuable skills, tools, and resources organizations need to bridge the generational gap and ensure inclusive growth. JEDI plus JSSJ is more than an educational program. It's a call to action to improve the future of every Jewish institution. Join the growing list of organizations committed to JEDI education and values as a profound pathway to a more just and inclusive world. This is your last chance to apply. Classes begin at the end of August. Just head to usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 390, Converting to Judaism. Thanks, Madonna. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are thrilled to continue our series of episodes exploring conversion to Judaism after taking a week off to explore Jewish Sunday schools. So today we're excited to be speaking with a dear friend of the podcast, a dear friend of Judaism Unbound, who is also now studying to become a rabbi and converted to Judaism. Our guest today is a returning guest, Marques Hollie. We'll give you some more of their elements of their bio in just a second, but first things first, we want to start by mentioning the ways in which Marques has brought his wisdom to Judaism Unbound. Marques was a guest on episode 326. They taught a mini course in the Yeshiva, and they were a presenter as part of Shavuot Live in 2021. We are thrilled to welcome him back as a return guest on the podcast in today's conversation. And now for a little more introduction. Marques Hollie is an operatically trained vocalist, ritual leader, and theater maker who's been telling and singing stories for as long as he can remember. Marques operates out of a belief that Jewish practice and ritual are expansive, resilient containers, and they enjoy exploring their identities as a queer, Black, Jewish person through original songs and nigunim, that's wordless melodies, liturgy, and theatrical work. Following a 2-year course of study, Marques received ordination as a Maggid, a sacred storyteller, and is now a rabbinical student at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Marques Hollie also serves with me on the board of Svara, the organization founded and led by B'nai Lappi, our very first guest ever on this podcast. To find out more about Marques Hollie, you can check out their website at www.marqueshollie, that's MarquesHollie.com. So without further ado, Marques Hollie, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you on again.
Thank you, Dan. It's a delight to be here again.
Well, you're one of these people, we were just talking about it before we came on, who is like, I think you've done like everything that Judaism Unbound has to offer other than hosting the podcast. You know, you're kind of one of our teachers. You're one of our people. You've taught in the Yeshiva. You're somebody who, you know, I don't like to say you're one of our rabbis because, as we've talked about, like I don't want that to only be said of rabbis. You know, typically we talk about somebody who's in rabbinical school, and I'm always kind of thinking, well, you know, that's somebody, they grew up Jewish and they liked it all the time, and then they decided they wanted to make it their profession, and that's not your story. So I'm wondering if you could share your story with us and how you have kind of made your way through the journey that has brought you here to rabbinical school, but also, more importantly, in my view, to just already being a great teacher of Judaism.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It starts somewhere between 1999 and 2006, the whole story. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So the first is that in 1999, I turned 13 years old. And that is when I realized, or was made aware of, for better or for worse, that I had identity as a queer person, that I was a young gay person, a young gay Black person living in the Midwest. And that is a truth that I remember being pretty okay with. I was just like, oh, okay, that's there. And then I decided to come out, as one does. And that was met with mixed responses. Some were very supportive. Some were very, like, we don't love that. And in my own family, the response was not a great one. And in fact, it is this part of the story where I have some contention with my family members about exactly what happened. So as I experienced it, I came out as queer, as gay specifically. And even though we were culturally Christian, because that's what you did in the Midwest, we were not what I would call externally Christian. There was no church or anything like that. We weren't doing any of that. But my admission of queerness changed all of that. And all of a sudden, it became a church every week, church multiple times a week kind of situation. And it was awful. I hated it. And when I turned 16 years old, I went and got saved, or so I thought. Went to a spring retreat, had a lot of feelings. There was crying, there was dirt, and all of a sudden I was Christian. I was reborn. And so for anyone who's like listening to this, if you've ever seen the Mandy Moore movie Saved, that was the life that I began to live. Flagpole praying, lots of Bible study, church multiple days a week. Eventually I had a job at a Christian bookstore. I was really living it. And it all sort of worked until one day it didn't. And the day that it didn't, I realized that there was never going to be a place for me there fully because of my queerness. It didn't matter how devoted I was, how much volunteerism I did, that was always going to be a point of contention. That sort of wound began to fester. And one day in 2006, when I was 20 years old, I was in the middle of a youth service. People were jumping up and down and speaking in tongues. This was a Pentecostal evangelical church. And I had a thought clear as day, and that was, this is bullshit. I don't believe in any of this. This is bullshit, and I have to go. And so I got up in the middle of the service, went to my Volkswagen Jetta, and just drove for hours and proceeded to have a complete and utter crisis, a crash, as Rabbi B'nai Lappi might say. If this isn't what I believe in, what do I believe in? What did I spend the last 7 years doing? What is going on? I rejected church, but I didn't reject the divine. I was like, there is something in me, there is some capacity, some willingness, some desire to believe in something outside of myself. Now, around this time, our friend Madonna, who was going by Esther at the time, was getting tons of press for studying Kabbalah. And as a good young gay, I was like, oh, what's Madonna doing? I want to know more about what Madonna's doing. And so I got a book called, I have it here next to me, God is a Verb, Kabbalah and the Practice of Mystical Judaism by Rabbi David Cooper. And I read it cover to cover. A lot of what he was talking about made sense. It felt very natural. And so I started to wonder, oh, okay, I'm a Kabbalist, easy peasy, that's it, right? That was the end of it. But then I realized that Kabbalah came from Judaism. And so I was like, well, maybe, am I Jewish? I don't know. And so I went and bought Judaism for Dummies. It didn't answer many questions. In fact, I had many, many more questions. And I was just like, okay, I don't know what's happening here. Maybe I'm just going to do this Kabbalah thing. I'm going to be like Madonna and do my Kabbalah thing, and that's going to be it. And then I met a gay Jew at Omaha, Nebraska Pride in 2009. And we got to talking, and I was like, I have lots and lots of questions for you. And he's like, okay. And so I asked him all kinds of questions about Judaism and sexuality and queerness, and he was very gracious about the whole thing. And at the end of it, he asked me if I wanted to go to Shabbat service with him sometime. And I was like, yeah, actually, I do want to do that. I don't know what's going to happen. Is it in Hebrew? Is it in English? Am I going to be like a total outcast, outsider, what have you? We go in, I've got the Siddur, I've got the prayer book, and we get to that prayer, the Shema, which I remembered reading about in Judaism for Dummies. And I even remembered, I was like, oh, I know how this goes. I could be one of the people who says this because I know how this goes. And so I got up and I chanted the Shema. That was the moment that I actually knew that I was meant to be a Jewish person. Because what I felt in that moment was this sort of golden thread somewhere in my solar plexus, just connecting me to everyone in the room, into the future and into the past.
Okay, I recognize that this is the time for me to come in with another question, but like with this story, I think I'm just going to say, and then what happened?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. So then I kept coming back, but I was also getting ready to move to Boston for music school. I went to the Boston Conservatory and I was getting ready to move to do that. I moved to Boston, got connected with a neo-Hasid, maybe not so neo-Hasid group for Torah study.
Neo-Hasid being sort of like a mystic Jewish group.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Lex. And they invited me for the high holidays, and I was like, "Oh, I've never done the high holidays, and you people all seem really quite lovely, so let's go do the high holidays." And it was the first time I'd encountered a mechitza, that divider between sort of assigned female at birth people and assigned male at birth folks in a Jewish space. And I didn't realize that that's what it was. I just thought it was just a partition in the room. And so I sat down, and someone comes up to me and they said, "Sir, I believe you're on the wrong side." I was like, "What do you mean the wrong side?" Oh, we split the genders. Oh, okay. Oh, this is maybe not the right vibe for me. But I went to the other side and I got the Machzor, the High Holiday Prayer Book, and I was like, "Okay, we're going to do this." And I opened it, and there was not a stitch of English transliteration anywhere. And so I followed along as best I could. I stood up when I was supposed to stand. I sat down when I was supposed to sit. And I left sort of feeling very confused. Later that same day, I think this was Rosh Hashanah day, I met some queer Jews while waiting for the train to go home. And I was like, "Where did you all come from for services?" Because I think I need to be with y'all. And
it feels like running into the queer Jews is like a recurring theme in this story.
It really is. They're like these, like there's like a signpost. It's like, you are my burning bush. Please deliver me out of whatever I'm in right now. I found them, found a new community, and I was like, okay, I have found my Jews. And so I'm in music school, I'm doing Judaism. My senior year of conservatory, I was like, okay, I'm ready to convert. My rabbi was like, "Yes, let's do it." And immediately I knew, like maybe not immediately, but about 3 months into that process, I realized this was not the time. Senior year of conservatory is not the time to convert to a new religion. And so I put it down, kept practicing Judaism, eventually moved to New York. And I'm singing opera. That's why I moved to New York City, was to sing opera. And I was like, I still do want to do this whole conversion thing. And I converted under the auspices of the Reform movement. So that meant taking an Intro to Judaism class. I took a class. It was, I think, 18 weeks. And of the 40-ish people registered, I was like the one person who was single, as opposed to married or engaged or married and about to have kids and sort of trying to figure out what that family dynamic was going to be. I was there only for the sake of myself, took the class, and I was like, okay, well, I did all of that. Now what? And so for a while, I stopped doing what I call like practicing Judaism, just was living it for a while. I was studying Torah and studying Talmud and leading services in New York and elsewhere. And eventually I got connected to a synagogue in Brooklyn, Congregation Beth Elohim, and Cantor Joshua Breitzer. One day he and I went to lunch, and he asked me, he's like, no pressure, but do you still want to convert? And I was like, I don't know, Josh, like, are you going to make me do anything else? I'm doing all this stuff. I'm studying text. I'm leading services. I'm teaching. What more do I have to do? And a paraphrase of his response was essentially, he's like, you're good. We can go to the mikveh tomorrow. We got our schedules together, and I hopped into the mikveh, and I came out a Jew. One of the more interesting things that happened that day is that when I was leaving the mikveh, so like the ritual bathhouse, on the way to a sort of festive oneg or little celebration that one of my coworkers was having for me to mark the occasion, was that on the way to her house, a man in a black SUV stopped me on the Upper West Side and started yelling out, "Rabbi, Rabbi, Rabbi." I was like, are you talking to, what? And he rolls on his window. He's like, "You, Rabbi." I was like, what? Yes, hello, what? He goes, "What are you doing on the Upper West Side?" I was like, I just left the mikveh. Why were you at the mikveh? I was converting. Oh, very good, Rabbi. Very good, very good. And then he hands me a scratch ticket and tells me that he's going to go be in a funeral minyan, so the group of 10, just up the road at the funeral home up there, and that he would see me later. And I was like, okay, like, bye. Have fun, be blessed. What is happening? And so that was 2018. And now, 5 years later, I understand that he saw something, he knew something that I did not yet know, that eventually I was going to live into that word, rabbi.
there's a lot of really interesting things that came up in that gorgeous telling of this story. I mean, there's a reason that you're ordained as a Maggid, or maybe it's not a reason you're ordained as a Maggid. There's a process that you underwent to be ordained as a Maggid, as a storyteller, that you can feel when receiving your stories. That's very powerful.
Thanks, Lex.
And one thing, first off, like, it's really interesting to me that you were the only one in that class that was not like in a relationship where one person might be converting due to or related to in some way their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I will say it does not surprise me so much given the geography, given that you were in New York City specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that dynamic of people converting related to marriage tends to be, and I don't have proof of this, I'm going based not off of hard data, but off of a very large set of anecdotes and experiences. I think that story is more common in high density Jewish populations in a New York, in a Chicago, in an LA, than it is in rural situations where I come across a lot of converts and very, very few of them are doing so related to a relationship that they're in.
Mm.
But I want to hold also that a key part of this story, and I'm not saying this to joke, is Madonna.
Yeah.
That harkens back to one of our early episodes in this series, in this mini-series, about how I have this theory that pop culture plays a much bigger role in Jewish conversion than we give it credit. I think for a lot of people, and I mean that in a lot of different ways, for somebody, it might be that their school does a Fiddler on the Roof showing, and for whatever reason that speaks to them in some way, and not that they like go and convert, but like that it plants a seed. For others, it's that they experience a TV show that features a Jewish character. There's an article about how somebody watched Yentl and that led them to convert. Yentl being the Barbra Streisand movie. If you have more to say about that, I'd be curious, because I think there's a lot of pressure, and I commend you for naming that that's part of the story. I think a lot of people, they watch a movie, they read a book, and that's part of what calls them to Judaism, and they feel some pressure to have that not be the thing. They want it to be just like this pure, I'm called to a theology that is Jewish, or I'm called to a community that is Jewish. No, it's not something so trivial as a celebrity, like especially a Madonna, who, we love to trivialize, even though she has played such a pivotal role in so many people's lives. So I'm kind of curious to hear more about those early phases. And also to start, are there ways in those early stages, or even after you converted, are there moments where you felt in a deep way that not only am I, Marques Hollie, somebody who's converting, but I'm experiencing that conversion tied to other issues in Jewish life, other topics that come up in Jewish life?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lex. I want to talk about Madonna for a little bit longer, and then we'll figure out how to weave the rest of that in there. For me, I think that there is a relationship between the catalyst for something, like the trigger that causes someone to explore something, and then what keeps them there. So for me, the trigger was Madonna and the Red String and the Kabbalah Center and the Ray of Light album, right? Like that was all part of what got me to explore, because I was in a place where I was like, okay, like I'm feeling pretty down and I need something. And I think had it not been for Madonna, who led me to Rabbi David Cooper, who led me to Judaism for Dummies, who led me to Choosing a Jewish Life, the book by Anita Diamant, and sort of all of those there are these like steps. And I honestly, one day, Bezrat Hashem, with the help of God, I really hope I get the opportunity to tell Madonna to her face that she started this all for me, because I am so deeply grateful for the life that I'm able to live as a result of my devotion to Madonna as a young gay person. So in terms of experiencing both the process of conversion and sort of the aftermath or the after effects of it, the queerness element has been really front and center, both in terms of how I have found my people and which spaces I feel most at home in. But the piece of myself that I think is harder is not the right word, but the thing that there's the Black thing. I'm going to say queer, Black, and Jewish, right? There is the Black thing when I am in Jewish spaces. And I was at a conference a number of years ago, and I was on a panel about Jewish diversity. And of course, And one of the questions someone asked me was like, how do you navigate different spaces? How do you code switch, more or less? It's not what they asked, but that's kind of the gist of the question. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, well, if I'm in a Jewish space, I'm still Black and queer. If I'm in a queer space, I'm still Black and Jewish. If I'm in a Black space, I'm still queer and Jewish. Blackness is not something that I can remove from myself. Whereas I could put a kippah on or not. I can put a talit on or not. And so what I have found most honestly annoying about being Black in Jewish space is that folks assume one of two things, right? One is that I converted, and yes, I did. And the problem with that assumption is that it assumes that every non-white Jewish person is someone who converted. And I know plenty of Black Jewish people and other non-white Jewish people who have whole ancestries of Jewish life. It's not their story. So that's that first assumption that's already wrong. But then it also comes into the fact that the follow-up is, oh, what's your story? There is this assumption that because I look like some kind of outsider in a space that maybe shouldn't belong to me, that that person has a right to interrogate or to question why I'm there. Mm-hmm. And they're so nonchalant about it. And it's so irritating. To me, it's like, I don't know you. Who are you? Like, maybe say hi at the little oneg, coffee hour after a service. Say hello. And maybe if we develop some sort of relationship from there, that is a conversation we can have. But there is this real desire to know why people convert to Judaism. I used to be sort of flattered by it, because often what would happen is that people would be like, oh, why would you choose this? Like, what's wrong with you? Why would you choose to be Jewish in America? And I could talk about how it means so much to me and how the practices are so meaningful and so deep. And after a while, it's just like, no, you don't get to have access to this part of myself without being in relationship with me and without me choosing to share that information with you. And so when I got the email from, I think, Micah about doing this interview, I was like, yes, these are folks who get it, who I am in relationship with, who I'm happy to have this kind of conversation with. And that's such an important part of just Jewish, not even pluralism, but just existing in Jewish space.
And yet also there are these listeners out there who are having a chance maybe to overhear a conversation that in a certain way they're not allowed to have. And I almost feel like, what are the gifts that we can give them through this conversation to not to sate their curiosity in a voyeuristic kind of way, but actually to try to get at what some of those questions are that people sincerely have about why somebody converted to Judaism. And now, of course, they shouldn't assume that everybody that they meet that converted to Judaism, they don't have to even think about, because, oh, well, I know exactly why they converted because I overheard that conversation with Marques. And of course, that's not true. Everybody converts for different reasons. And so there's a kind of a weird reality. And maybe the answer is that people should just kind of mind their own business. I'm wondering if there are things that have come up in those other conversations that people have had questions or you have had answers that you have found particularly compelling, particularly valuable, so that if this conversation is the one chance that your average person out there who is born Jewish and feels awkward, maybe rightly so, to ask anybody their questions, that you think like, yeah, these are some important things to say.
Dan, I love the way you framed that. And the thing that comes actually right to the top of my mind is this idea that I've had for a while, that because I converted to Judaism, because I chose Judaism, there's a certain amount of privilege in that, in the sense that I don't necessarily have familial Jewish baggage. I got to choose this because I got to engage with the tradition in a particular way, because I got to find my people right away, because I got to be surrounded by a spiritual and religious practice that didn't have to sort of fight or struggle against itself to see my humanity and to see my worth and my value in that. I think that is probably the biggest offering I think that I have from some of these conversations, is that so much of this questioning comes from a person's collective experience of Judaism from their whole life. That could be bad camp experiences, that could be being in Jewish day school and hating it. There are so many things that could be, or that could mean for someone who's asking me this question. And so when I'm feeling particularly generous, the generous read of the situation is that converts get to be in this place of privilege where we got to choose this. We got to leave the baggage of other situations, of other practices, assuming that we had that, to be part of the Jewish people. And I think that as a concept is really hard for folks who have some sort of religious trauma with Judaism to wrap their head around.
I want to think about a few dynamics which collide against each other in certain ways that I think are challenging. So you were talking before about how the assumption people make that you converted because you're Black, and they're presuming that anybody they see in a Jewish space who's Black and is Jewish did not start their life Jewish. That's obviously a wrong assumption to make. And even though in your case it happens to be that you did convert, it doesn't feel good to have people assume that. I think that's so important. And I think when I say that there's different pieces colliding up against each other, like the awesome thing is Jews by choice don't always look stereotypically, not just around race. There are ways in which people who convert to Judaism do, in fact, push our boundaries in our heads of what we think a Jew looks like or speaks like or where they live or what their past is. Like, there's a wonderful article from many years ago, somebody who identifies as a Viking Jewess, whose family is North European, traces to groups that are, associated historically with Vikings. And I believe, if I'm remembering the article right, that she actually converted Orthodox, but like her kids have middle names that are like Thor, or like they're like I found it so beautiful. We need to say multiple things at the same time. We need to be able to say the folks that you think in a room must have converted, they might not have converted. And you might just need to, like all of us might need to stretch ourselves to recognize that there are lots of Jews by birth who are not white, who are not, curly haired, who are not East European, all of the things that we tend to assume. And there are people who bring their difference, and that's amazing and exciting. Whether that's somebody who brings a connection to Viking culture, there is a way in which folks who come in bring something new. And I think so often we want to pretend that what converts do is all they do is they are pining for something that they don't have. And so they join Judaism and they become the thing that Judaism already is. They latch on. And whatever they were before, and I've talked about this with names. We literally change their parents' names in Hebrew to Abraham and Sarah. We imply that they go all the way back, not always, but the traditional thing is that you imply they go back all the way to Abraham and Sarah. But it could be that we don't want to say that they only latched on to that tradition. Not to say that they don't have just as much of a lineage to Abraham and Sarah as born Jews do, but that we might want to be jazzed and excited about the things that folks who convert bring in that are not sort of seen, quote unquote, as native or whatever to Judaism. So I guess that's a long way of asking, I've asked some other guests in this series this too, what are some of the superpowers that converts bring to Jewish life? And to the extent you want to think about the superpowers that converts who are marginalized in other ways bring to Jewish life, I'm interested in that too.
What a powerful question. Wow. So when it comes to superpowers that converts bring to Judaism, the one thing that's kind of really sticking out to me is the opportunity to experience Judaism as this expansive and resilient container. I'm using that language specifically because in my experience, when someone has the opportunity to look at a practice, a spiritual tradition from their own eyes, from their own lived experience, and see that as something that they don't necessarily have to shrink themselves into or become smaller to fit into, but as this container that can expand to meet them and include them, that kind of empowerment is huge. And I know that, again, this is not everyone's experience of Judaism or why they even came to it. But in the circles that I am in and sort of thinking of my own experience, being able to engage with this as not something that is like fixed and rigid, but as something that is flexible and can bend and can change shape and shift has empowered me to find different expressions of Jewish practice. It's empowered me to try different practices, different approaches to halakha or Jewish law. And it's given me this ability to say, okay, this is how I'm going to practice Judaism. Here's all the stuff that's in Judaism, and there's a lot of it. And this is how I'm going to craft my own practice. And I think that kind of empowerment for folks who have converted also lets other people, converts or not, re-examine or reinterrogate their own relationship to Jewish practice and how they want to engage with it.
So I have been known to say sometimes when I'm talking about the book of Genesis, especially Genesis and to some extent the Passover story in Exodus, I often say to folks that I'm jealous of folks who converted to Judaism as adults, or at least I'm jealous of the genre of folks who did not have a deep relationship to Genesis or the Passover story as children. And the reason for that is that I think that experiencing Genesis as a child gave me a certain set of initial relationships to it. And I think that built into the experience of being Jewish by birth, and sort of if you participate in Jewish collective storytelling, myth-making, holiday marking, etc., is that you get a taste of it in a very kid-friendly way, and then sometimes are stuck there. And it's hard to get out of that. And this comes up, I mean, the holiday of Purim, I think sometimes we struggle with this. We like learn a very child-friendly story of the holiday of Purim, which concludes with genocide. It concludes with a bunch of death. But because those of us who are Jews by birth and experience that story as very young kids, experience it as young kids, we're usually shielded from some of that. And then as adults, it's like, oh my gosh, a bunch of stuff was hidden from me. If you find Purim for the first time when you're doing an intro to Judaism class as a 25-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 60-year-old, you're less likely to have that initial like wrong telling and then have to unlearn it. And so I actually think that spaces that don't have either converts or people who, they might have been born Jewish, but this is the first time they're ever experiencing the material. Like spaces that don't have people in beginner's mind, I actually think are impoverished spaces. They will not be the level of magical and exciting and energized that I want in the world. And this is true, by the way, of people who are not Jewish and have not converted too. Sometimes if they're part of Jewish communities and celebrating these celebrations, they can bring a lot too. But I guess I'm kind of curious, like, can you talk us through ways in which Jews by choice bring a set of strengths, skills to Jewish communities that we really not only need to be like, oh, let's be tolerant of converts, but we need to be like pining for their contributions?
I really appreciate the use of the phrase like beginner's mind, and especially your framing of it as not as like something to have to work against or aspire to like be out of that, but as a like, oh, like this is when you're approaching a topic as if it's for the first time every time, what are you going to uncover that maybe was never seen before? What can you ask of it that maybe no one else who's done it 1,000 times can ask of it? That is a way that I try to generally operate. And so when it comes to, uncovering or finding sort of new ways of looking at things, I'm going to go personal here for a second. A bunch of years ago, I was at a Passover Seder, and the Haggadah, sort of the guidebook for the Seder itself, was using the Exodus story, but through the lens of human trafficking. That was really mind-blowing for me. And I was like, oh, this is actually really profound. What happens when we take this story we've been telling for thousands of years and find a way to apply it in a contemporary sort of solutions-driven sort of way? That got me thinking about Passover and what does it mean? What does liberation mean to someone who is like Black and queer and Jewish and living in the United States? with our own actual, very real, tangible history of chattel slavery. And so that's led me to do some writing, some thinking, some music making, just by asking like that one question. It's like, oh, what does this look like? Or what does this mean for these identities that I hold? I think one of the superpowers of the convert, or one of the necessary, not features, but environment for the superpowers to come forth, is actually a space in which to do that. And I'm thinking a lot about sort of my own experience and how it sort of took me some time to find where did I fit. And once I found where I fit, I could start to be vulnerable, and I could ask these questions and think about these things out loud. One of the things that allows the superpowers to come forth is finding the right community or communities that a person can fit into. Once someone has that, and once they know that they are valued for exactly who they are in that space at any given moment, then that, for me, is what is the catalyst. It's what's the trigger to allow for deep interrogation, that sort of deep questioning, maybe, something that someone had been taught as a child, to allow them to experience it a different way. And I'm thinking of what you were saying about Genesis. That first word, Bereshit, I had always been taught, like in sort of my Christian life, that means in the beginning, right? And as someone who has now since converted and knows some Hebrew, I can look at that and say, oh, actually, this is not it's not a definite beginning, it's a beginning. And I remember the first time that I started to make that connection, my mind was totally blown, because there were so many possibilities that opened up. To kind of go back to your question, the superpower itself is, I think honestly, it's the beginner's mind. It's the ability to ask those questions that have maybe never been asked before, to allow new Torah, new ideas, new wisdom to emerge from the tradition.
Switching gears a little bit, Marques, I wanted to ask you a little bit to reflect on, if you have theories. This is now we're moving from the realm of storytelling to theory generation. I'm wondering specifically about the anecdotal, and I think there's starting to be some studies and certainly some articles written about a phenomenon, so to speak, where there seem to be a lot of queer folk converting to Judaism these days. Mm-hmm. And I think we could speculate as to why. I'm not sure that we really know why, but maybe it's a perception that at least there's a slice of Judaism, the slice that you and us occupy, that's kind of very open and positive about queer folk. Maybe there's something more deep there about a connection between queerness and Judaism. I'm not sure, and I'm curious about your reflection about that. But also, I'm curious about your thoughts on the analogous question vis-a-vis people of color in general, and specifically Black people, and whether we could imagine a reality in 20 years from now, 30, 40 years from now, I don't know when, when you think back to when the LGBTQ synagogue started, where there was a time a few decades ago when you would not say that there was really a slice of the Jewish world that was very open to queer folk. And essentially queer folk created their own neck of the Jewish woods. And over time, a neck of the Jewish woods emerged partly out of the stuff that the queer folk had built that was then, open and welcoming and embracing of queer folk. And I'm just wondering what it might look like if that would happen with Jews of color. Or maybe it could happen, of course it should happen, that Judaism is very, very open, but maybe it still wouldn't be that a lot of people of color would want to become Jewish, because maybe there's a way in which queerness and Judaism have more similarities in some level than color and Judaism, or not. And I'm just sort of curious about your speculations and theories on that regard.
Yeah, I think starting with sort of the queer folk converting to Judaism question, this is totally anecdotal, but in my own experience and sort of an experience of some of my friends, like when they meet queer people who happen to also have some sort of spiritual identity that is not like, witchcraft, which, do you, it tends to be Judaism. Queer folk who are born Jewish have more spaces to engage with. And so when they're in their spaces that are just queer and they're meeting other people, there's relationship that's happening. It's like, oh yeah, like I'm queer, but I'm Jewish. And I go to like this synagogue, or I studied Talmud at, this yeshiva, this institution of Talmud learning. Or, oh, we're doing this really interesting ritual for the Rosh Chodesh, for the new moon, for the new month, specifically for trans people. Because those spaces exist, there's a lot of relationship building that can happen and a lot of sharing that can happen that I think wouldn't exist otherwise. As it relates to people of color, it's hard to answer. So I'm going to answer this from the perspective of just being like a Black person. We are seeing, or I am seeing spaces where that sort of centered identities for Jews of color, thinking, about Amud, the Jews of Color Torah Academy, Jews of Color Field Initiative. I think I got that acronym totally right. More of these kinds of institutions being built. But I think there becomes a question of, if you're a Black person and you're heterosexual, there are likely going to be more Jewish spaces where you might feel are more open to you just by the nature of being a cisgender or a heterosexual person in the world. And that in and of itself, I know people get really charged about this word, is sort of a sense of privilege unto itself. So like a lot of the organizing that I have seen just sort of in my own life that centers people of color who are also Jewish tends to also be queer people of color who are also Jewish, because there is that added element of otherness. There's an added element of danger that we are trying to actively mitigate against. And don't get me wrong, like I said, in my own experience, I have been to a fair number of Jewish communities who are like chill. They're like cool about it. But there's a difference between being in a place that's like cool about it and being in a place where you are like actively centered and made to feel that you are part of the kahal, that you're part of that community, that sacred community of people.
So the Maggid part of you, the storyteller of you, I look out at Jewish tradition. There's a whole lot of stuff that we call Jewish tradition, a lot of stories, a lot of texts, a lot of rituals, a lot of holidays, a lot of rules. In terms of stories, I think part of our issue potentially with how we fall short in terms of actively empowering converts as participants, as leaders, as creators of Jewish life, we don't have a lot of stories that are really well known in Jewish tradition. We have Ruth. Ruth is like sort of the convert story. I think if you bring up conversion to many rabbis, to many lay leading Jews, and you're like, so if we want to talk about conversion, we want to like hang it on some ancient Jewish text. It's like, oh, we got Ruth. We have a character who can be read as converting. Now, we won't go on the whole tangent about whether she did or did not convert. I think it's actually more complicated than it seems. But at the very least, we have somebody who takes on elements of Israelite identity when she did not begin her life with those identities. And it seems to be a powerful experience for her and potentially for the broader community. Cool. Mm-hmm. One story is not enough. And especially when that one story is tied to a specific calendrical moment in the year, Shavuot, which I think subconsciously, if we have a story and it's tied to a holiday, we feel like, we already have that day elsewhere. So I'm not going to really talk about Ruth in November because we'll have it in June. I think part of the thing we need to solve, and I do think it's solvable, because I think we create the set of stories that are sort of quote unquote canonical, that hold the I think we need to be generating stories where it's not just about people who are born Jewish and like, we talked about pop culture. I think there's a million stories about people who are like not super connected to their Jewish identity and they find their way to Judaism for one way or another, but it's usually that they were born Jewish. I can think of fewer well-known stories, whether it's from our like textual tradition or from pop culture or from anywhere, where the process of becoming Jewish really is anchored as a key story. I can think of one from a sector of Jewish tradition that has been cut out from the Apocrypha. There's a character in the book of Judith named Achior, and there is no ambiguity. He like converts. He starts as not Israelite. He expresses that he wants to be, I'm sorry for the spoilers. It's an old enough book that I feel like I can do spoilers. He expresses that for a variety of reasons, he seems called to this people. And the way that you know that this is really, really, without going into the ins and outs of circumcision, the text says that he's circumcised. And so I guess I'm curious, like, from you as a storyteller, What might it look like strategically to go about that process of like better and more thoroughly building narratives of conversion, and not just like having welcoming communities, but having like layers of tradition that ground those welcoming communities?
I think the first thing in terms of strategy, right, is like, who does that work feel like most meaningful to actually like to start to do? I think it's one step. And then I think the next step becomes a question of, okay, is it a matter of mining the tradition, right? Are we going to mine, Talmud and Apocrypha? Are we going to maybe do some more imaginative re-understandings of how we understand like Abraham and Sarah? Because they didn't start as Jews, God picked them, that's how that went down. Is it about sort of starting with that like foundational story and sort of branching out from there? And then with every story, there in my own storytelling practice and the way I've sort of been trained is that there's something that the story is trying to teach you. You, the person telling it, and sort of whoever's like listening to it or watching it or reading it, what have you. What is not so much the purpose, but what are the teachings of a collection of stories that uplift and ground identity for folks who converted? Which, I think that there are lots of ways to answer that question, but those are sort of the three prongs that I see about it. And for me, I'm going to tell a short story. So when I was in my Maggid training program, we had to write a certain number of Divrei Torah, of sermons. And one of my classmates often remarked that I would find a way to go back to Genesis, irrespective of which parsha the actual Devar was about. And we got a good laugh out of it. 2 years of this every Sunday. It became sort of my thing. In thinking about that and in thinking about this question of strategy, I think part of it is actually going to the beginning of some of our stories, of some of the foundational canonical sort of tales that we tell, and really making sure that there are certain details that are understood. Like you were talking earlier about how Genesis as a kid, or if you learn Purim as a kid, like there's a certain understanding that you have of it. That certain understanding is sort of what allows people to gloss over sort of the idea, again, of like Abraham and Sarah didn't start the world as Jews. They did not come into existence in Torah as Jewish people. How do we include that from the beginning? And then maybe there's some fun bonus material, bonus stories, stuff in the Talmud, Apocrypha that also support that actually, folks, there have been people converting, there have been people choosing this or being chosen, as the case may be, from the very beginning.
And that, by the way, I mean, you just gave me, I hope this will never leave me. I mentioned before that like there's a tradition of when people convert saying Ben Bat Mi Beit, child of Abraham and Sarah. And I've always thought of that just as, oh, well, we are tracing you back to the beginning of the Jewish people. But I haven't thought of it as you are, like they are, somebody who converted. Maybe the folks who came up with it, that would make them like less excited about it, because I think part of the point of it was to try and make it less clear to everyone that the person converted. You give them like Jewish ancestor names when they're called up to the Torah, so they're not called up by other names. I really love your callback to Genesis. So clearly it is your thing.
And I actually there was the same rabbi who I was studying to be a Maggid with actually taught me about sort of the convention of, Ben Bat Mi Beit Avram V'Sarah as something that is just that. It's convention. Like you don't have to choose that. And when he told me that, I was like, what? Like at the time I was a Ben Avraham V'Sarah, but I was like, wait a minute, you mean I get to change all of this? And he's like, yeah, you don't have to. And he sent me sort of, the rabbinic response about it. And I was like, oh, this is so rad. And so when I became a Maggid, my actual certificate with my full Hebrew name is Salam Michael Mi Beit Yaakov. Because for me, when I read the story of Jacob, and I think this gets back into convert superpowers, to me, Jacob is queer as the day is long. And this is someone who I feel that kind of deep connection to. So I think it gets back to that question of like, what's law, what's very strict and cannot change versus what's just the thing that we've been doing. And there's actually some flexibility. You can sort of choose your own adventure for some of this.
And just to point out something that you said that your name is your first name, I think you said Sela Michael, and then you said Mi Beit Yaakov, from the house of Jacob. And just to note, there's no spouse there.
Mm-hmm.
And typically you could say, oh, well, it'd be a really radical thing to go from a Jewish name that has a man and a woman to a Jewish name that has two men. But you're saying, for example, I'm just saying one person from the house of one person, which I don't know if you want to talk about it, but it itself is an innovation.
Yeah, once I realized that I could change it, I sort of went wild. Who do I feel connected to? What do I feel called to? Like, who do I want to be named after? Who do I want to carry with me up to the bima, up to the front of the synagogue when I'm called up there? It was a two-part process. The first was deciding that I was not going to be Ben anybody anymore. It was going to be Mi Beit, from the house up. As a non-binary person, that felt better. And just it also felt much more comprehensive of my experiences of reading Torah. When I landed on Jacob, I was like, okay, there's something here. I don't quite know what it is yet, but I was thinking about Jacob and sort of the 12 tribes and Moses as this great liberator. Like there was this chain. I was following these other characters, these other folks in Torah who have these incredible stories. And as I was starting to sort of map out their various family trees and look at it also on Wikipedia, because it was actually easier that way, I was like, oh, this all comes back to Jacob. And that's it.
When you say you looked it up on Wikipedia, it just reminds me, I think I heard Yehuda Kurtzer say this recently, make this point, that Philo of Alexandria, who is considered one of the most important commentators on the Bible, Jewish commentators on the Bible, did not read Hebrew. All of his commentaries on the Torah were on the Greek translation of the Torah. And just the idea that, yeah, we can look up things in Wikipedia. We there's no shame in that. Philo of Alexandria was doing, the analogous thing of his time. I wanted to ask you as a closing question, we talked earlier in different ways about things that we hope that those folks out there who are listening to this podcast who are born Jews, what would be some important things for them to hear. But we also know from emails that we're getting from folks that we've been getting for years and years, but that we're getting especially as part of this series, that a lot of the people out there who are listening are people who themselves are on the path of conversion at some place or another. As somebody who took, did I calculate it right, that 19 years from start to finish in terms of your own conversion?
If we're starting
you said
from
1999 as the...
Yeah, if we're starting from there, I always count from 2000, like I hold by 2006 as the year it all started. But yeah,
well,
19...
even that, I mean, I'll accept that as a friendly amendment. As someone who took approximately 13 years, I guess I have two questions. One is kind of, do you have a closing thought for those folks? And also, I'm just curious how you think about the difference between, you can imagine somebody taking 13 years from start to finish in their conversion journey, and you can kind of think of somebody, maybe it was almost like you, where you started the story, who in a certain way did it in a day, did it in a moment.
I'm thinking about pop culture right now. When I was younger, loved Sex and the City. Like, got the whole Pink Bible DVD set. I still have it somewhere in my house. And I watched that show. It did not age well, just to be clear. But there was a storyline, a pretty prominent storyline, where Charlotte, this sort of Episcopalian princess from the Upper East Side, marries an Orthodox-ish, maybe actually capital C conservative, perhaps Jewish man. And in order to marry him, she has to convert. She goes through this process where the rabbi turns her away 3 times. On the 3rd time, she ends up interrupting his Shabbos dinner, and she has to sit down and sort of deal with all of that. And then he teaches her Judaism. And she takes like accelerated classes. So she's there like 3 or 4 days a week so she can convert as fast as humanly possible. And when I first was really thinking about converting, I was like, okay, if Charlotte can do it in a year and a half or whatever, surely this will not take me that long. Like, how involved can this process be? The joke was on me that the process is actually very involved, and not necessarily because it itself takes so much time, but there's a lot of living that you're going to be doing from the time you start the process, from the time you start thinking about the process, till the time the process is actually complete and you're out of the mikveh and you are a Jew. The first real community that I felt really close to when I was living in Boston was Temple Sinai in Coolidge Corner. And one of the congregants there who I loved, this couple, David and Jody, David told me one day that it took him 20 years to convert. And I was in my undergrad degree, I was in my early 20s, and I was like, 20 years? How? Like, what? Like, did you write a Torah commentary in the process? Like, what were you doing that this took so long? And he was just like, when I was ready, I was ready. And so when I think about my own story, whether that started in 1999 or 2006, it had to be the right circumstances, it had to be the right time for me to really make that decision and really say, okay, now we're actually going to take this final step. And so for anyone who's in the process or thinking about it, I don't want to say it's going to take as long as it's going to take, even though it will, but also that remember that while you are learning Jewish practice and studying Jewish practice, you're also living it. And take the time that you need to live it. And we'll all be much better for it.
Thank you so much, Marques Hollie, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, guys.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A reminder before we fully close things out, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur aren't that far away, which means Elul, the final month of the Jewish year before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, is really not far away. It's coming up in just a couple weeks. And that means that Elul Unbound, our annual initiative where you can experiment with this on-ramp month into the high holidays, is coming back. So you want to head to JudaismUnbound.com/Elul. That's JudaismUnbound.com/ELUL. You can learn what Elul Unbound is if you haven't participated in the past. You can find out about our Zoom gatherings we're going to have. You can join our Elul email list, which you really want to do so that you can stay on top of all the content we'll be sending out to everyone. All that is possible at JudaismUnbound.com/ELUL. So get excited and head there. We also, of course, want to close this episode by encouraging all of you to be in touch with us, and there's a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, you can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com, and you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We're also deeply appreciative if you're able to support us with a financial gift on either a monthly or recurring basis or just as a one-time gift, which you can do via JudaismUnbound.com/donate. The very last thing we'll say is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.